Hello, this is Matthias Goertz with my monthly COVID-19 update. As always, I will share my screen with you. Okay. Welcome to my 1st of June update for year one after Homo sapiens. The topic is hysteria and hysteresis, and I will explain that later on. Let's start. Let's start with our 3 Silly Monkey Prize for notable steps taken towards destroying our humanity. As always, we have a lot of contestants. I will run you through the shortlisted ones very quickly. And this is in order of appearance in the media. Number 1, Australia imposing drastic travel bans on their own citizens, basically preventing them from traveling home if they've been to India. And the punishment, the penalty, if you were to try, could be up to 5 years imprisonment. That's quite unprecedented. I mean, we've talked before about Australia not even allowing their citizens the most basic of all rights, which is the right of abode in their own country. So here you have a case where the nation state completely breaks down because the most fundamental of all its premises is broken. So I equipped these 2 gentlemen here on the picture with the appropriate Nazi symbols, but it's really quite worse. But I can't think of a worse symbol. So, but this is certainly a strong contender. US President Biden setting a goal for lots of Americans to be vaccinated. That's all good and well, and urging younger teens to get vaccinated. But of course, my point of view on this is this just further reinforces the completely mistaken view that everybody should be vaccinated, which is absolutely not the case. People are being vaccinated that don't benefit at all from the vaccine. At the same time, there's still people around the world at this moment who would benefit from the vaccine but can't get it. So you have an oversupply in the United States that is being wasted on people who don't need it, and at the same time an undersupply in many other places. So this is, you could say, yeah, but it won't do any harm. No, it doesn't do any harm to these people to be vaccinated, but it doesn't do any good, and it's a waste. And it's a waste, especially at a time where there's still shortages elsewhere. But the main point for me in this is that it sends the wrong message. It doesn't tell people, look, most of you guys don't need the vaccination. It tells the opposite. It pretends that everybody would benefit from a vaccine, which is absolutely not the case. So I think that's a worthy finalist. Germany and the World Health Organization to set up a global health monitoring center. Well, that's about the scariest thing you could imagine. You have these 2 individuals down here who have done more to foster this crisis that we're currently in than most other people have. Tedros by announcing a pandemic where there's no pandemic, and Merkel closing her borders even to EU members and imposing export bans on medical equipment, even to Italy, only because in a dozen or so small villages in Lombardy, in northern Italy, there were a lot of cases. And in doing that, Merkel sent very strong signals to the world. This is a nation state thing. There will be no collaboration. The first thing we will do is close the borders and stop exports of anything that might be useful to us. So this is like war, right? This is like a war situation. And a strong signal to the citizens, this virus is scary, it's very dangerous, and the world has changed overnight, and all the rules that we knew and all the values that we held dear until yesterday no longer prevail. Those were the messages that Merkel sent to the world when she closed Germany's border in March last year. So these two individuals have done more to foster this crisis than almost anybody else. And these two individuals are now coming together to set up a health monitoring system. Oh dear. I mean, imagine Hitler and Mussolini coming together to set up a, Black Lives Matter kind of organization. Can you imagine that? That's about what this is, right? The two people least qualified to do anything about global health monitoring, because we know they will just screw it up, right, and make the worst of it, come together to do that. I mean, that is quite a remarkable instance. This one is more on the funny side. You know, the monkey in the Philippines, his name is Duterte, but I think he is a chimpanzee, except his brain is smaller. He orders arrest for people who violate mask rules while not wearing a mask. So this is more for the fun factor. I mean, the guy is not serious, right? And as we all know, the Philippines will survive anyways, no matter how bad the leadership, it doesn't matter. So the guy is actually irrelevant, but he's funny, right? I mean, he's funnier than any Trump or any Johnson or any of those clowns. Right? This is the super clown. So we are grateful for having fun. We put him on the list. US backs waiver on vaccine patents to boost supply. That's very bad news. That may sound nice, but it's very bad news for two reasons. One, economically, as most people know, sends the wrong incentives. It disincentivizes vaccine companies from investing in research and developing new vaccines. So it sends exactly the opposite signal that you would want to send. And we've just seen how well it works. If you let the private sector just get on with their work and develop those vaccines required, right? It works beautifully. But here again, some government thinks they need to intervene. And this is the US government of all governments. But yeah, democratic, I guess you would sort of expect this from a Joe Biden, right? But this is economically completely wrong-headed. But I think, again, more importantly to me, it again sends the wrong message. It says this COVID situation is so bad or so different or so unexpected or so unusual that we have to impose totally unusual measures that we normally wouldn't, right? So it's again this idea that there is something going on that compels us to completely forget all the values and all the ideals that we've developed over centuries. Right? Just throw them out with the bathwater. I mean, this little baby, right? And that's exactly wrong, because actually this is by no means a situation that requires any of these special exceptions. Right? It's just simply not needed at all, right? And by announcing these things, Biden just pretends and conveys to people that it is, but it isn't. So it just prolongs the agony because people, oh, this is special, this is scary. No. It just prolongs the agony, and instead of getting us to say, hey, we can just stop this tomorrow, right? It's so easy. So it's very unfortunate. Now, other countries have not agreed to this, so probably this is not going to happen, thankfully. But I mean, just the announcement itself is, it's really not helpful. Biden doesn't understand that some of his announcements are extremely unhelpful. Eurovision, Rotterdam, no, this is a nice one. Remember last month I talked about the UFC staging, their competitions in front of fully sold out sports arenas with 14, 15,000 people, shoulder to shoulder, no masks, etc., etc. So here's Eurovision, and what do? They reduce the capacity of the arena down to 20% of the normal capacity, so 1/5. So 4 out of 5 seats are being left empty, so I guess so that you can space people or something. And a negative test certificate is required. So, I mean, spot the contrast. UFC was my winner of the Lady Liberty Prize last month because they go back to normal. Eurovision is on the blacklist here because they go towards a new normal, right? As if it's sustainable that 4 out of 5 seats are not being used. It's ridiculous. It's completely nonsensical and has no value at all from any kind of health perspective. None, zero. So and it's all discriminatory, of course, with the certificate required and all that. It's discriminatory. It's against any basic laws and basic rights to attend events and so on and so forth. So it's quite sad, right? I mean, by now I would have expected that at least in Europe, people would start taking some serious steps towards back to normal. And this is continued muddling through and not really going anywhere. That's very sad. Now here's the private sector jumping in on it. Cruise operator, we expect all cruise guests to be vaccinated. I mean, this is the next level, right? Where now private operators can arbitrarily put demands on people as they see fit, apparently without limits. I mean, they could just as well say, we want only white people on board. We don't take any black people. Well, I mean, who is to prevent them? Right? If they can do this, they can do anything. Right? And again, it's the governments that are fostering this with their poorly conceived message. Boris Johnson will push for vaccine passports with other world powers. So this is, I think, the G7. I mean, this is, this is very bad news indeed, because Boris Johnson is the one who only about a year ago proposed to inoculate himself with the virus to demonstrate how harmless it is. And it is just as harmless as that. So he was in a way right. He just didn't know that, because I presume that was just a publicity stunt. He didn't end up doing it, I think, but he was just meant to garner support and votes, and as politicians do, right? He had an inkling at the time that the majority of Brits didn't want to get into a crisis, right? And so he would have been the hero who said, look, it's all okay, right? He changed his mind at the time, probably just because the majorities shifted and the majority of Brits did seem to be concerned, right? So bottom line is, as a politician, he doesn't care what is right or wrong or what's the truth or what's the lie. It doesn't matter at all. It's just finger in the air. Where's the wind blowing? Oh, wind is blowing from there. Okay, then I lean in that way, right? Well, that's what politicians do. And so he's now done a complete U-turn, right? From being on the one extreme to say, I would even inoculate myself with the virus because I believe it's so harmless, all the way to the other side of the extreme. Oh, now everybody has to carry a vaccine passport because it is so dangerous. Yeah, I mean, and he has no hesitation doing that, because I mean, consistency or credibility, that all does not matter. He just has an instinct that right now a lot of people want to travel, but they are worried, what it means. And hey, vaccine passport. Right? So it's just catering to what he perceives to be the majorities, right? And I understand that in a democracy and even in a dictatorship, you do prefer to be with where the majorities lie. It makes your business of staying in power easier. There's no doubt. But there's absolutely no compass, no moral or let alone just thinking and plausibility and logic kind of compass here, nothing. Right? I mean, these people like Johnson can turn on a dime like this. And, before you know it, in a few months, he will say, oh, no, it's harmless. Don't worry, right? I mean, wherever the wind blows. Right? So I think that's quite remarkable how, with what ease these people just lie, right? Because in a way, it's a lie, right? Because they don't believe in what they say. It's not possible to believe in both, right? And you might say, oh, maybe he learned something. Yeah, but no, he didn't learn anything. He knows how to put his sail into the wind, and he always knew how to do that. And that's the only thing he knows. He doesn't actually care about the actual situation and what is actually the case. And, it's not relevant, right? It's just, where does the wind blow? And okay, I make sure my sail is in the wind, right? And then I will get speed, right? So so Boris Johnson surfing. But of course, the problem with this is that this isn't trivial. Right? 8 billion people may have to, in the end, carry these stupid passports just because people like Boris Johnson wanted to put their sail into the wind. Right? I mean, these passports will not have any other purpose, right, other than keeping some politicians in power, and some companies who supply the infrastructure in profit, right? But I mean, that's the only purpose these passports will serve, right? Apart from that, they will just terrorize everybody. They will make everything more complicated. Every border crossing will be a pain. Presumably, every 6 or 9 months, you then have to get a new shot. I mean, just think about 8 billion people, right? But that is totally not on Boris Johnson's mind. He doesn't care, right? He just thinks this will give him credit with the voters, right? Yeah, so that's a good one. And the winner is Boris Johnson, for seeking to institutionalize what I call dehumanization indefinitely, because these passports will be dehumanizing, discriminatory. They will force us to do things we don't want to do, and we don't benefit from, and we don't need. Right? It will just be layers and layers and layers of burden on us. Potentially all 8 billion of us, at least those 1.5 billion of the 8 billion who want to travel in a year. So here he is, our favorite dunce. Actually, he's very intelligent, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying these people are stupid. They're very intelligent when it comes to how to hold on to power. Right? They have a very powerful instinct and intelligence as to how to do that, right? And unfortunately, the voters play along all the time, right? They think it's great. Oh, he's listening to us. No, the politicians is not. The first thing they should do is not listen. The first thing they should do is abide by the law and defend the constitution of their country. That's what they should. Listening comes later, right? It would be useful if they could think, but we know they don't do that. So we don't expect them to think. But no, their job isn't primarily to listen to majorities and then hammer down on the minorities just because the majorities want it so. That's not the job of a politician. So I put a little swastika here on his collar. But to me, he's really more like a clown, a flip-flop clown. But a dangerous one, unfortunately, because he's got a little bit of weight in international affairs. Okay, over to Lady Liberty for notable steps taken towards regaining some of our lost humanity, if ever. Okay, finalist. Yeah, unfortunately, like last month, I only have one. It's not for lack of trying or so, but it's just not a lot of positive things happening at the moment. So here's actually three people who are nominated here. They're the governors of 3 US federal states, states of Texas, Florida, and Alabama. All 3 happen to be Republican. And all 3 did something quite remarkable, because they passed bills or executive orders in their state to ban vaccination passports, both in the public services, but also in the private sector. There are some other US federal states that have banned vaccination passports for public use in governance and public services, but not in private sector. So those bans are weaker. But in these 3 states, at least those 3 that I know of, the use of vaccination passports is banned altogether. And that is, of course, excellent news, because if if several significant states in the US refuse to accept them, it would be hard for the federal government to try to push vaccination passports nationwide. And the power, apparently, in terms of these decisions, lies with the governors of the individual states. So at most, maybe the federal government could impose vaccine passports on the staff that works in the federal services, or maybe in the District of Columbia, I suppose, or something like that. But they can't really force the states, I think, to adopt something that the states themselves have already banned. So this would put a spanner in the works if Biden and his team were to try to do a US federal vaccination passport. And if the US doesn't, and the White House press secretary Jen Psaki already said, at least at this point, the federal government has no plan to introduce vaccine passports. So that's good. So knock on wood, if we're lucky, the US will just simply refuse to have such a passport, as it should, right? Because it's completely contrary to any of the basic values of the United States, any of the things that the United States were founded on in the first place. But we'll see. But it's a move in the right direction. It sends a signal, a good signal, a positive signal. And if the US doesn't do it, it would be hard for the EU and other big players, to enforce something globally, right? And in fact, it would be impossible because the US is such a big travel market, both in terms of export and import of travel services, right? Meaning people traveling there and people traveling from the US elsewhere. In both directions, it's a very important market. So it would be probably impossible to have a global solution if the US doesn't partake, and that's very good news. So that may then dampen the EU's enthusiasm for such a solution, which is my hope, right? So that's why the winner is these three governors of the states, respectively, of Florida, Texas, and Alabama. And they are being awarded this month's prize for protecting citizens from gross discrimination and abuse of privacy. Yay! And yes, they're all Republican, and yes, there is a pattern. Okay. Wow, let's take a quick break. That was pretty quick, huh? Good. Let me just have a quick breather. A 1-minute breathing meditation. Welcome back. I never thought I would one day become a fan of the US Republicans. So funny. I've even become somewhat of a fan of Trump, as you may have noticed. Yeah, I mean, I used to be a big critic, not a public critic, but I used to be critical for myself of the so-called neocons, if you remember, the Bush Juniors of the world and those types who would just wage war on any country they liked, sort of claiming all liberties and freedoms for the United States and none for any other people, right? Or for the massive support of Israeli terrorism against Palestinians for the last 70 plus years, right? I mean, Israel being the world's biggest terror organization and having for 70 years now basically terrorized the Palestinians, stealing their livelihoods and their land and committing ethnic cleaning everywhere in Palestine and basically trying to eradicate the Palestinians, right? Which they can't because they are more productive in terms of baby production. So for every Palestinian the Israelis murder, two new ones pop up, so bad luck. But the Republicans especially, generally the United States government, but the Republicans especially, have been the biggest supporters of this terrorism. So the US government and the US Republicans have been the biggest supporters of terrorism on earth for the last 70 years. So I've not been a fan of the Republicans in many ways, but what I do see at the moment is they are protecting citizens' rights. And they're doing that more and more effectively than the Democrats, as far as I can see. And I always like to give credit where credit is due, right? Even if I'm not a fan of the Republicans, maybe I am about to become one, who knows? But I would still not support the Israel policy at all. So that won't change. Anyway, so COVID-19 scenarios, nothing new. We're slowly lumbering into ever the same direction, which is southeast. You could call this the dunce corner or the stupidity area, right? Where the virus and the disease becomes ever more insignificant, and our response to it becomes ever more destructive. Right? You couldn't be on a worse place in this, right? If you were on the bottom left, where we have a really destructive response to a really big problem, you might at least say, well, maybe something will come of it in terms of overpopulation being reduced, or something else. But to be on the bottom right of this graph, that is just silly, and nothing will come of it. Nothing. I mean, there's nothing we are learning from this, other than that we are stupid. So it's very sad. It's the saddest part on this whole chart. Okay, global infection levels, as always, update. Yeah, as you can see, it's going down this month. Why is it going down? I said before, it cannot actually go down, right? The numbers can only go up. It's just in the model that it goes down. So you would ask, why isn't there a lot of activity in India right now? And the answer is yes, there is, and that's exactly, funnily, counterintuitively, what is driving the numbers down in my model. Let me explain that. For India, I had a very high multiplier for fatalities. So registered or reported fatalities, I multiplied by a multiplier that was quite high, 5 to 6, I think, to get to something like actual fatalities, on the grounds that India has been poor in reporting these fatalities. Many countries are underreporting the fatalities, but India more than most. And because India is so big in the model, that of course had a big impact on the overall multiplier of fatalities, which on average, I think last month was 2.6 times. So 2.6 times as many people die of COVID than have been reported to die of COVID. And a lot of that 2.6 factor is driven by the very large multiple for India. Now, this month, that India has really taken off in terms of fatalities, and especially in the richest and second largest of the states, Maharashtra, I continue to adjust that multiplier. I've done that before, I've talked about this before, on the presumption twofold. One, as time progresses, more and more, a bigger and bigger percentage of all fatalities will actually be reported because there's more SARS-CoV-2 testing, PCR testing going on, so they can actually identify and diagnose more properly, and they will register them more properly. So the assumption is, in those countries in which originally at the beginning the reporting was very poor, and there was a lot of the countries, almost all the countries at the very beginning, didn't fully report because they didn't even have the PCR testing capability to even know whether someone had died of COVID or in conjunction with COVID. Right? They knew it was a pneumonia, but they couldn't pinpoint that it was a pneumonia originally triggered by SARS-CoV-2. Right? You need the PCR test to do that. And so the PCR test, of course, over time has been rolled out to more and more places, and more now people are actually able to diagnose. Also, governments, I think, once they have their focus on this, they will tend to want to get better data, right? They may not do this for other causes of pneumonia, but for this particular one, everybody has their attention on it. So you can imagine, this is conceptual, right? I don't really have good data to support this, but conceptually, you can imagine that they get better and better over time in registering and reporting these fatalities. So India, especially where there's now so much activity, that really comes to the fore, especially since the activity is in richer states. One of my assumptions has always been the poorer a state or nation, the less they're reporting. All other things being equal, of course, you have special cases like China who don't report at all, or other totalitarian regimes where you just simply cannot know because they completely control all data and all media. So, basically it's meaningless what they report, right? But even among countries where you say, well, they have some degree of free media and some degree of trustworthiness in terms of their data, but they just can't do it because they're not equipped to do it well, you can still expect that over time, and the richer they are, the better their reporting. Right? And the richest countries in the West, their reporting is pretty accurate. So that's sort of the thinking behind this multiplier. And so now that India has a lot of activity, going down the learning curve fast, and in the richer part of the country, I have significantly reduced that multiplier. And I may continue reducing it next month, right? So I'm driving down the India multiplier. Now, since there are so many fatalities, it doesn't mean that the penetration, the infection level in India has gone down. It hasn't. It's actually gone up in my model. But India is representative of a lot of other poorer countries, Pakistan, in my model, Pakistan, Bangladesh, countries with high populations, pretty much all of Africa, where I don't have individual data, I drive their multiple off the average, and the average is dominated by India, right? And I try to adjust even for, what types of countries, how similar are the countries to a place like India or some other places, right? So I'm trying to use India, because it's so big and in a way typical, as a driver of what multiplier apply to other parts of the world where I don't have data. In India, at least, you remember, I have quite a few local data points from antibody tests, right? Several states conducted antibody tests and found quite a lot of people's antibodies. Therefore, the penetration is higher than maybe you would have thought, etc. And I was using those to model India. So for India, although I didn't have national data, I had multiple local data points, and I tried to weave them together into something. So at least I have something. In a country like Pakistan, Bangladesh, or most of Africa, I have nothing. So I used India as a sort of a model for other places as well. And since I'm now driving down the multiplier for India, I'm driving down the multiplier for a lot of other countries as well, significantly. And that, it basically means there are fewer cases in Africa, or lower penetration in Africa, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, Afghanistan, the Central Asia, etc., where I don't have data, than I had thought, or then let's put it this way, then my model would have predicted previously. So funnily, because India is so active right now, I adjust that multiplier down because it's the right time to do it, and that then has an impact on all the other countries and drives everything down. And the net result of that is that we actually lower, the number is lower this month than last month. You can see the trend is still the same, right? And I already indicated before that it's inevitably now flattening because of vaccinations and also because of natural herd immunity, right? The closer you get to herd immunity, the flatter you expect it to become, right? And then the vaccines come on top of that and flatten it further, right? So there's no surprise if you were to draw a line through this green line that is a bit more like straight, but it would be bent a little bit, right? And it would be bending gently down, not down, but flatter. It flattens. And that's exactly what we expect. So there's nothing unusual here. It just looks funny on the graph maybe, but it's just adjustments in my model. Right? And the idea is that I get ever closer, hopefully, to what may be the actual numbers, right? The actual multipliers, right? I said before, there's a limit to that, because once the vaccinations really hit, they overlay the natural progression, and they will make it, they're starting to make it impossible to know what is the effect of the vaccines versus what is the effect of the natural progression. So it's getting ever harder to fine-tune my models. So maybe within the next 1 or 2 months, I will stop fine-tuning the model because I just can't. But this month I decided, based on the India data, to make this adjustment. And so funnily, because in India there's so much activity, the number is low. I hope this was clear. And here's the equivalent, of course, for the fatalities, right? You know, the fatalities are driving the previous page, the incidences in my model, right? So it's the fatalities that I trended down. So if you look at the multiplier here, 2.1, last month this was 2.6. And that's a big difference, right? That really makes a big difference. And that explains that both the overall excess fatalities, which are a key driver in my model, and then also the COVID part of the overall excess fatality, which is, you know, the green line, both of them bending down this month, right? And I imagine that next month, maybe that multiplier will drop down a little further because India is still active. So the same, you know, I may trend India down a little further, and then the overall number will also trend down further. But I suspect, as I said, we are not very far away from sort of freezing the model, just because it gets so overlaid with the vaccination and the impact that it no longer explains what would have happened naturally. What is the natural part of what's going on versus the artificially induced via vaccinations? Right? So I think I expect that multiplier, maybe it goes to 2 or 1.9 or 1.8, but you know, somewhere around there, probably it will then harden and remain. You may recall this multiplier has gone down repeatedly. I think when we started out, I think last June or so with my model, or even May, this multiplier was 4, I remember. And then, you know, gradually came down, and now we're at almost 2. So it just simply means over time, countries become better and better at reporting the fatalities. That's all it does. Right? We are now basically roughly at 50% accuracy. 50% of all fatalities are actually reported. And this is excluding China. Right? China doesn't report any fatalities. So, but the rest of the world, they're now at about 50% reporting of the actual fatalities in my model, right? And it will not get much better than that. Maybe they get up to 60% or so, but there's a limit to this. And that's, I've explained last time, I think, at length, why there is this underreporting. And so let me not repeat myself there, but there are good reasons why there's underreporting. And it's just not known what the underreporting is. There's nobody out there who can say this is by how much each country underreports. It's not there. So my model is just an attempt to approximate on a global level what that gap is, because I'm interested in numbers that represent the actual. We don't know the actuals, of course. I don't know the actuals either, but I'm modeling the actuals. So this is a model of what could be the actuals, right? And the actuals right now are twice as high than the reported fatalities. And 12 months ago, they were 4 times as high, right? And this gradual adjustments, I make them every month or every other month, I make adjustments, and they lead sometimes to some funny ups and downs in the curve. At the very beginning, when I made adjustments, I still try to go back and then correct the previous month so that the curve looked a bit smoother. But I think I mentioned it before. At some point, I just stopped doing that. It's a lot of work, and there's no point really, because it's just a model anyway. So as long as you're not distracted by the fact that the curve sometimes goes down as well as up, which in real life it couldn't, it can only go up. But as long as that doesn't bother you too much, it's doing its job. At any month, it's the best projection or estimate I can give you. Okay? That's what it is. Okay. Remember, we were mapping actual progression. So if you recall, I was using Sweden as sort of an ideal country, recognizing that it's not very representative, but by ideal, I meant it didn't have a whole lot of government intervention, at least not until the beginning of this year. And so if you could put a curve through the fatalities in Sweden, it would give you a typical uninhabited, undisturbed natural progression of the virus in a Northern Hemisphere country. And by natural, I mean not disrupted and changed by significant government interventions. Any government intervention changes the natural progression. So if we have heavy-handed government intervention, which we have in almost all countries, then the curve you see does not represent what it would have been under natural circumstances. Of course, natural circumstances differ from country to country. Sweden is not very densely populated. People are very disciplined, etc. As I said before, someone told me, well, if you were in Mexico, it would look very different. People behave very differently. It's very crowded. People hug each other all the time, whatever it is, right? They're not very disciplined. And, you know, I don't mean to dwell on these stereotypes or so, but I'm just saying Sweden obviously is just one way of a natural progression. There would be others in other countries, but because most countries had heavy interventions, there is no natural progression. So I picked Sweden. There's data, and we know the interventions by the government were quite light. And so it's, at least for a Northern Hemisphere country, it is somewhat representative of what the natural progression would be. And that natural progression here is depicted by this green line. This is not a statistically generated line, it's just a hand-drawn line. Underlying it is the 7-day moving average of fatalities, and I'm just drawing a line along. And I did that for the first year, and then I just duplicated for the second year, just assuming that the second year would be normally the same as the first year. Which is not necessarily true, right? Because first of all, we have vaccines now, so that changes everything. But also, even naturally, once there's a high degree of herd immunity, the curve wouldn't be this steep, potentially. Maybe it would go down a bit. Or if after 6 or 9 months, the antibodies from the earlier cycle here, the peak cycle, have gone, then the next peak could actually look the same again, right? So we don't know that exactly. And because of the vaccines, and because Sweden did in the end have some interventions, we will never know. We will never know how this virus would have propagated naturally, because there's too much intervention by human beings. But Sweden comes close, so I'm using that. And then I map it against the actual Swedish data. At the early stage, there was significant technical errors being done by local health authorities in Sweden, especially around old folks' homes that were not properly equipped, and quite a lot of people died unnecessarily, unfortunately. So I'm arguing that this early peaky curve in Sweden was higher than it would have been naturally if people had just reacted, let's say, in an educated and effective way, right? which I think naturally humans do, right? Without breaking the law, but just defending themselves, within the law against germs, which we naturally do, right? So, for example, one could have recognized very quickly that oxygen was required in all old folks' homes. In fact, oxygen was required in every home where there are old people, even private homes where there. One did not, right? Neither in Sweden nor anywhere else, but in Sweden they were hit really hard by fatalities in old folks' homes, and they were quite slow to react to that. So the numbers early on are a bit high, and that's why I hand drew the green curve a bit lower, because I don't think that's natural. I think that's an exception. That only happens once at the very beginning because people don't know better, but they won't repeat the same mistakes. So that's why the curve in the second year will not be as high as the actual reported data here would suggest, right? So the green curve is a bit lower. So, and then I duplicate the green curve and just wave it over the years, as you can see. And up to December or early January, the curve in Sweden is pretty much what you would have expected. And then the government did intervene and did impose some restrictions. And the reason they did that was because the vaccines were on the horizon. Remember, in December, the first vaccines appeared. And of course, those people who are in the Save Lives camp would correctly argue, now that we have the vaccines coming up, we actually really can effectively save lives by slowing down the virus and in parallel vaccinating people. And that is correct. Right? So there will have been a lot of pressure on the Prime Minister in Sweden, whose philosophy was not to impose anything significant on the people and rely on their own individual responsibility. But at that stage, the pressure from the public or from the opposition party or even within the governing party will have increased significantly because of that logic, that people said, now that we have the vaccines, it really measurably saves lives if we slow down the virus, right? And you cannot deny that. You could still have the standpoint and say, yeah, but keeping our rights is more important, right? You could make that argument, but you cannot deny in that moment that slowing down the virus at that point can save and will save lives, right? So the Prime Minister, I think, gave in a bit, and not too hefty, but some measures were imposed, and you see an effect, right? You see probably the white area here, which is basically lives saved, presumably, unless the curve then overshoots later. I get back to that in a moment, which it will probably do in Germany, so I'll show you that. But in Sweden, that may not be the case. So unless it overshoots later because of a yo-yo effect, you would actually net have saved lives, and that's not an insignificant. If you took the integral over this wide area here, that's not an insignificant number, right? So yeah, so that's what we can see from this data. But of course, it requires you to roll out the vaccines in parallel really fast. And Sweden has been okay, not super. Now, the other interesting thing in Sweden, in the last 5 or 6 days, they have stopped reporting. And that happens sometimes. I mean, we've had a few countries here and there stopping reporting for a while because they reset the system or recalculate or reallocate, within their accounting, and, then come back and say, okay, we've revised the numbers and numbers are now more solid, and here they are, right? So one possibility is that Sweden is going through a rejig of their number crunching, and in a few days they come back and say, okay, here's the revised numbers, right? But at the moment, if you go on Worldometer, they're not reporting. They already, since late last year, they've stopped reporting on weekends, Saturdays and Sundays. But now they have stopped reporting altogether. Any weekday as well, for now. So that's interesting to me. So, okay, it could be that they're rejigging the system and they will come back soon. It could be, I thought maybe there's a big holiday and people are taking some time off, and it turns out that the next Sunday is the Swedish national holiday. And I thought, do they have something like a golden week, like in Japan, where you take the whole week off up to that national holiday? I don't think so. I don't know that they do, but maybe there's something going on there that they're just sort of not reporting because everybody is on holiday. That's a possibility. But the third possibility, which is the intriguing one, is that they've decided to stop reporting. Right? And that, of course, would be wonderful. Right? Because, I mean, lest you haven't noticed, this is completely unusual, unnatural to report these figures. We don't report these figures for any other viruses or illnesses or fatalities, right? I mean, every day a number of people die of, a heart attack that is way bigger than the number of people dying of COVID, right? But nobody reports them. Nobody reports them. So, influenza kills a lot of people every year, but nobody reports that, right? Because it's all below the radar screen. It's all considered normal. It's, healthcare systems will have their statistics, and if you're interested, you can go into their system and you can find those statistics. So it's not that it's like secret data, right? It's publicly available. How many people died in your country of influenza last year? I'm sure you can, well, not in all countries, but in many countries, you can find that data if you want, right? But it's not pushed up to the surface where the media jump on it, right? It's not something that is in the public domain in terms of being debated, right? It's not something that the politicians care about, Right? That's the difference. Right? For some reason, this COVID, that's been different. And maybe Sweden, going a logical step from their basic approach, would say, we are past, we're done. I mean, we're vaccinating all the people who need vaccination. We are done, right? And therefore, why should we report this? Right? That would be very logical. In fact, all countries could stop reporting this now, right? Oh, they should never have started to report it, is my view. But they did start. But they could stop any day. But Sweden is just having that mentality so far, where you might think maybe they actually do that, right? They might actually just stop reporting it, right? And not like China. China is hiding something, right, from their own citizens and from the world. Sweden is, if they were to stop reporting, not to hide anything, because you would still probably be able to, at the end of a month or at the end of the year, they will have compiled that data and you can find it. It's not that they're trying to hide something. It's simply because it's normal not to report this data. Right? And the signal would be this: we're back to normal. Yeah? If a country like Sweden stopped reporting, it would signal to the world, we're back to normal. That's all. And that would be wonderful, right? So I'm kind of hoping for that, of course, but yeah, we will have to wait and see. Maybe, as I said, maybe next Monday they're back on stream and reporting again, right? Or maybe there's some fourth factor that I haven't thought of that made them not report for a few days, right? Who knows? Maybe the system is down or something, something funny. So yeah, we'll see. But there's a little bit of a hope here that Sweden is setting again the standard for the world, as they did with their policies, although nobody followed that standard. I guess the standard is only a standard if people actually follow it. No other country copied it, unfortunately. So maybe I shouldn't call it a standard, but it could have become the global standard. It should have become the global standard. And again, here they may just be the front runner to say, look, we are back to normal, and therefore there's no need and no reason now to report this anymore, right? We are not reporting all the other fatalities that are, some of which are much, much more significant on a daily basis either, right? So yeah, that would be very logical. Whether that's actually the case, knock on wood, right? Okay, Germany, as I just alluded, Germany is a bit different from Sweden. They hammered very quickly. Merkel was one of the first, as I said, to pull out the hammer. They also hammered all the way through the summer. So there was very little activity early on. Surprise, surprise. And finally, there was a lot of pressure to start releasing things a bit and letting people have a bit of a life again. And of course, they did that just when the autumn came, which is, of course, exactly the time when the activity goes up, right? They should have done that much earlier for the summer, but they did it after the summer, which is exactly the wrong timing. I think I've talked about this before. And guess what? You get a yo-yo effect. It shoots up, and you can see it shoots up more than in Sweden. Sweden didn't have a yo-yo effect because they never clamped down, right? So that a yo-yo effect, and eventually it gets so high that it sort of forces, or at least the politicians believe that it forces them to pull out the hammer again. And so Germany in late December, right after Christmas or so, hammered heavily again. And yeah, the numbers go down, and then at some point they slowly release again, and bloop, the numbers come back up, right? Not very significantly, but you can see that now, as of late May, the German figures now are above the green line, right? So that's significant. Now it's early days and it's only a little bit. So, I mean, that could be just an illusion, optical illusion, because of course my green curve is not optimal, right? But let's say it's not an illusion. And conceptually what it could say is that, see, you get a yo-yo effect again. And secondly, by minimizing activity during the winter so much in Germany, they had very significant impositions over the winter, you push out the overall influenza and common cold season into the early summer. So by reducing the activity, you extend it. Because the virus still needs to do their replication, I mean, they're life forms just like us. They don't give up easily. So they will just keep going a little longer than usual, is my guess, right? And I'm saying this as someone who knows very little about viruses, okay? But logically, that's what you would expect, right? They make up for it by going on a little longer. So in other words, countries like Germany that have had very heavy impositions on the virus over the winter may just be extending their common cold season so that the virus just remains active longer than it would have otherwise, right? And that's what we seem to be starting to see here. But let's see another month's data, then we'll see whether we are clearly above the green line or not. But it's quite possible. The other thing, of course, is now that the vaccines are coming, that would counter that effect, right? It wouldn't necessarily reduce the virus activity that much, but of course it would definitely reduce the fatalities from the virus activities. And we are measuring fatalities here, right? So the fatality curve is inevitably going to go down, not only because of seasonality, but because of the vaccine, right? However, Germany was quite slow with the vaccination, slower than most Western countries, I would say. They did accelerate strongly recently. So at the moment now, they're really boosting up their vaccinations and overtaking some other countries that they were lagging before. But because the the vaccine is lagging, or the effect of the vaccine is lagging, right? Because the person dies 4 or 5 weeks after they're infected, and the vaccine, if you vaccinate today, the number of fatalities will be lowered 5 weeks later, right? So if Germany has had a very substantial vaccinations over the last month, the months of May, which it had, the full effect of that will happen in early July. Yeah. So we will probably see that the fatalities may be above the green curve for a little while, for months or so, and then they will start dropping down just because the vaccination really hitting its target. We'll see. We'll look at it again. It's kind of fun to see. At least we're trying to have a feel for how the virus works and also how the vaccines now come in, right? And how the imposing and then lifting of constraints, creates, waves, right? We've talked about it before. So in Germany, you can see that quite nicely. The wavy pattern is because of government intervention. Right? If no government intervention, you would have a Swedish curve, which is the green curve, which is a gentle, seasonal propagation. Okay, finally, we have the US. The reason I picked the US is because it's also interesting in its own way. You can see that the US also follows the green line, the same pattern. It's also Northern Hemisphere country. But pretty much along the entire period until recently, the US data was always a bit higher than the green curve, meaning the Swedish, meaning there were per capita more fatalities in the US. That's interesting. I mean, some states are more rigorous than Sweden, some US states. Others are maybe more liberal. So it's a mixed picture. So it's kind of difficult to figure out on a national level, right? Because they cancel each other out, or in some cases they aggregate even further. So you have maybe more complexities going on because your level of decision making, there's a government, but it's somewhat limited. Then you have the state level, which is very relevant, and then you have a local level, which is maybe a little bit less relevant than in Sweden. Whereas in Sweden, you have the national level, which sets the strategy and the overall policy, and then you have the very local level where they do the execution. And you don't really have that state level, I think, in between as another layer of decision making. Whereas in the US, that layer is very important. So this is much bigger country than Sweden, much more complex in terms of having 3 layers of decision making rather than 2. Germany is more like that. Germany is similar to the US in that respect. But Sweden maybe is not. And so the comparisons anyways are tricky, but you can see generally it follows the Swedish curve, but there's always a bit more permissibility. There's always a bit more activity than in Sweden at any time, especially also during the summer. So I suspect that in America during the summer last year, people were quite free, relatively free to move with some regional differences. Northeast New England was quite rigorous. California was quite rigorous. some of the states in between were not, right? So big variations, but and also you have in the US more different climate zones, so that would be another factor. They may not have exactly the same pattern of seasonality of viruses that you have in Sweden, just because the US is such a big country, so it covers different climate zones, some of which will be very similar to Sweden and others will be not similar. There will be desert climates or semi-arid, or even in the south of Florida, you almost have tropical climate. So, you have a bigger range of things. So anyways, but it's interesting to see. So the Americans were largely laissez-faire, but depending on the state. And then in early January, the vaccine started kicking in, right? I mean, they shipped the first vaccines in December. Well, let's not say early January, let's say late January. The vaccine started really hitting us because, as I said, there's a time lag, right? But you can then really see that the numbers went down in late January without, I think, any significant new impositions by the government. There may have been some in some states because they felt the numbers were getting out of hand and they had to do something, But I think a lot of this decline is probably really due to the vaccine, because the US was one of the quickest, together with the UK, to roll out vaccines, and I think they've also been, by and large, very intelligent or rational about who they gave the vaccines to. I mean, by and large, they gave the vaccines to those people who actually benefit from them, meaning people above 65, et cetera, as I said before, previously, many countries have not done that, at least at the beginning. There were quite a lot of countries who gave the vaccines totally to the wrong people, who didn't need them at all. So then they're just wasted, right? They will have no impact on fatalities. If you give your vaccines to young people, no impact on fatalities, right? Or very little. I mean, there is a secondary impact of the vaccine, which is it does slow down the virus a little bit, right? It does, right? Even if you give it to people who would not get sick anyways, but if they take the vaccine, they're less likely to be infected and therefore less likely to transmit an infection, right? So the whole transmission activity does go down, even if you vaccinate the wrong people, right? So it slows down the transmission, and therefore then it slows down as an indirect effect the fatalities as well, right? But it doesn't protect anyone from falling seriously ill, right? Because if you give it to people who wouldn't fall seriously ill anyways, because their immune system just works. Right? So some countries gave out vaccines to those people who didn't need them, and then you have little impact on your fatalities. Whereas the US, I think they gave the vaccine to the right people from the start, and made it very accessible very quickly, et cetera, and made it very practical and pragmatic, and it shows. So that's a real success story. And I keep emphasizing that it's primarily Trump's success story, because he's the guy who ordered all these vaccines, right? Now, Biden and his regime have done a good job in rolling them out once they were there, right? So both have done their part in this, but there's a general, apparently cross-party consensus in the US that we take those vaccines and roll them out and give them to the people who want them, right? And that's worked beautifully. Yeah, so well done. And yeah, you see that, they saved some lives probably, that wide area below the green curve, and now, catching up with the green curve again. But, they continue to drop. And I wouldn't be surprised if they were pretty much hugging the green curve over the summer, which you would anyways expect because it's summer. But yeah, not in the US, right? In the last summer, they were above the green line. So in the summer to come, they will be maybe not above the green line. Huh? They will be very, very low. And most importantly, and this is really the key, come the 21st of September, come the next autumn, where you would expect a pickup, if things go the way I conceptualize them, there will be no pickup. Or some minimal pickup, right? Because you haven't vaccinated everybody who is eligible and who should get, some people just don't want it, some people don't come forth. So you're never at 100% vaccination of those people who should be vaccinated. right? Maybe you get to 80% or 90%. There will always be some people left over. And, lo and behold, next autumn, they might still get infected and die, right? Or a new variant comes about that is so different from the previous variants that the antibodies you have produced, either because you were naturally infected or you got the vaccination, are not good enough, right? And then if your immune system is compromised and the vaccine doesn't really do its job, then you might again be at risk, right? If there is a significantly new strain. We know that from influenza. Right? In influenza, every so often, every 20, 25 years, there's a completely different new strain that emerges that is so different that the previous protection, whether from vaccine or from natural infection, no longer really works, at least not for all people. For some people it may work, but for some people it may not. So you'll have, again, a situation of some immune systems not being up to the challenge. Right? That can happen, right? And that could even happen as early as next autumn. We will see. I'm curious to see. But generally speaking, conceptually, people will be so well protected that fatalities in the autumn should be quite low. They may go up a little bit, but quite low. That's what we're expecting, right? And that then will really show in this graphic, right? If I continue to track until then, and if the US continues to report, maybe they also stop reporting. But if they did report, if I did have the patience to continue tracking this, then in autumn we can really see the impact of herd immunity. That's what we're all looking for, right? I mean, we know conceptually that it's there, but then we will really see it empirically. Okay, so we're watching this. Next topic, the topic of diversions. I've talked about, remember I've bucketed countries into 4 categories. I've called Sweden the normal country in that it does what at least a democracy ought to do, put the onus on each individual to say, I'm responsible for my own health, and I show solidarity with my neighbors, and I behave in a responsible way. And that served Sweden very well. The average fatality per capita is lower than in the EU average. It's lower in the Western average, if you include the US and Canada and Switzerland and Norway and some other Western countries. They are below average, so they have had fewer fatalities than all those countries, or almost all those countries that had those heavy-handed impositions. That's interesting, isn't it? And I showed the data a few months ago, and I said maybe eventually I'll show them again when the dust sort of settles, right? Because you never know whether maybe some shifts again happen. But if shifts now happen in terms of fatalities, they are more likely due to differentials in vaccine rollout. So if Sweden was very slow in vaccine rollout and other European countries were quicker, then Sweden's average fatality rate would go up relative to the other countries, but not because of their policy, but because of their slow vaccination rollout, right? But it's not the case. I mean, Sweden's vaccination rollout is about the same speed as the rest of Europe. So it therefore will not really impact those averages in fatalities. So as of now, Sweden has a below average fatality, and at the same time, a way above average level of freedom for their people. And it's probably the only country in the world that can still somewhat claim to have worked within the borders of their laws and within the limits of that set by their constitution. Maybe not entirely, but close to. So that's what I mean by normal. Unfortunately, normal is very special. There's only one country in that category. But that's what every country ought to have done, basically. That's what I mean by normal. Then you have the back to normal countries. Those are countries that they did have impositions. They did do some policies. As I said, in the US, it's a bit mixed bag depending on which state and which party is running that state, etc. But they had impositions, and in some places quite significant, in others less. And all these other countries there in that list have had impositions of some sort or another, but not too heavy-handed in general, and more oriented towards getting back to normal. Yeah, not trying to create too much stuff that you can't get rid of later on. Right? So not trying to go towards a new normal, but just trying to get back to normal as fast as possible. Then you have the models 2 countries, mostly European countries, a few others. There I've said they're neither here nor there. I mean, on the one hand, there is some degree of protection of individual rights, and on the other hand, there's repeated impositions by governments, and they talk a lot about balancing those two, but it's not a balancing; it's a muddling. They're muddling the waters. It's generally not served them very well, this policy. It's not performed well. The fatalities are nevertheless pretty high often, and their liberties have been cut significantly. So there's a lose-lose kind of situation in many of these, unfortunately. Yeah, but that was, as predicted, I would have said that last March already, that's what was bound to happen. So I'm not surprised, but yeah, it's panned out that way. And then you have the new normal countries, mostly in East Asia. Yeah, they pretend that they don't want to go back to normal at all. They embrace the new normal. Like, oh, for the rest of our lives, we all wear masks. We will not travel anymore. I don't know. I mean, I don't get it. I'm just observing. But yeah, they behave like that, right? As if this is now the new normal. Right? As if it was normal for a human being to terrorize themselves because of a common cold virus. No, that's not normal. But there are countries that make you believe, or at least they make their citizens believe, that this is normal. The new normal. And you get some people really excited. They wear like the mask and then the visor, this kind of face shield on top, and then, oh, we're in the new normal now. And I'm like, are you really excited about this, or is this all a joke? For some people, it's not a joke. They think it's lovely. Yeah. Okay, so naturally, these countries have slow natural penetration because they clamp down on it a lot. And at the same time, they have slow vaccination ratios because they don't think it's necessary to vaccinate people. No rush. We are in control. We are so good at controlling the virus. Why do we need to vaccinate? Right? So the presumption is that people will accept any suppression you throw at them. Yeah, basically they never had any rights, so therefore they are not missing them, right? And they don't mind if you lock them in at home or whatever, right? They accept it, and therefore we are not in a rush to vaccinate people, right? Because we are not rushing back to normal. We are happily dwelling in the new normal, right? So predictably, both the infection rates are low and the vaccination rates are low, so therefore they are a long way from being done. If they ever want to be done, which is not certain in some of these countries, right? That this is not becoming a permanent thing, right? So you can see the numbers here on the right, the number of months to herd immunity. So what I've done, I've compounded the infection ratio, which is the natural infection ratio, and the vaccination ratio, which is, if you like, the artificial way of getting to herd immunity. Right? I've compounded them in such a way, they're not simply just additive, because a lot of the vaccinations go to people who were already previously infected. So that vaccination is wasted, it doesn't count, because they already were protected, right? Having been infected before, right? So I need to avoid the double count, so to speak, overlap of those two sets. There's a significant overlap. So that overlap I need to eliminate. But apart from eliminating the overlap, then they stack on top of each other, and together they create an overall herd immunity, right? And those countries where it says NA, in terms of how many months it will take to reaching 80% herd immunity, 80% penetration, where it says NA, it means they're already there. They already have herd immunity. Either purely naturally, like Iran, Mexico, South Africa, who basically got there just before the vaccines really started to be rolled out. So doesn't mean they don't need the vaccines, because there's still 20% of the population who still haven't had the infection, right? So, you know, you can still roll out your vaccines to them and protect them by all means, right? And there are also some experts who say, even if you've been infected before, still take the vaccine on top. It doesn't do any harm, and it may give you extra level of protection. That may be the case. So I'm not against that, except I would say at this moment where we have shortages, give that vaccine to someone who has not been exposed, right, and who is in the risk group. They are the ones who benefit most, right? And if in your country you don't have those, then take your vaccine and give it to your neighboring country. Right? That would be rational. Right? But of course, most countries by and large don't do that. Instead, they rather vaccinate people in their own country, even those who don't need it, right? As I said before. So yeah, yeah, some countries, they're basically almost through naturally, and now the vaccines come on top, so they are basically done. And then you have countries like the US, the UK, Chile, where they were still quite far away from natural herd immunity. Maybe they were at 50% or 60%, so high, but not near 80% yet. And then the vaccines really massively came on top and basically filling that gap and accelerating those countries to herd immunity. For some funny reason, the US is not quite there yet, 0.7 of a month, so 3 weeks away from reaching that 80%. But yeah, all of these countries, and then Russia, okay, Russia is a bit further away, but not that much, according to my calculation. So all of these new normal countries, back to normal countries, by and large, they're at herd immunity now, right? Again, doesn't mean they are done, because if you're at 80%, you still have 20% of the population not yet covered. Still, you want to get the vaccines to these people or to those at risk within that group. Plus, if your experts say so, yeah, give some vaccine to people who had been already infected, but whose antibody count is low, and you just put the vaccine on top. It doesn't do any harm. In fact, it may really give additional protection. So fine, right? But so when I say they are done, and I don't mean done completely. There are still things they can do, but it's then time to shift this whole affair back down below the radar screen of politics, right? Hand it back to the health services and say, okay, you just do your thing, right? You give vaccines to those people who want it. It's just like with influenza. In Germany, for example, all the elderly people, when they see their house doctor every year will tell them, please get a booster for influenza, because every year there are some new variants, and we know your immune system is probably compromised at your age, right? If you're like 84, like my mom, right? And her doctor tells her every year, do get a booster for influenza. It will give you additional protection, and sometimes she does it, and sometimes she doesn't, right? But that's the normal, right? It's her decision to say, okay, I take that extra boost, or to say, no, thank you, right? It's her decision. She's an adult, right? If she then next year didn't take the shot and then she gets influenza and dies, then that was her choice, right? That's the normal way of dealing with this, right? And these back to normal countries, they are pretty much all now at a level where they could do that. They could just give it back down to the technocrats in healthcare to do the right things. And for the politicians, there's nothing else to do other than just, oh, we're back to normal. The normal rules apply. You can huddle and meet and do what you want and travel, and that's it, right? Unfortunately, they're not doing that yet. And I'm certainly worried that they will take a long time to get there. I have a little blue box here about the UK, because Johnson just announced recently that, we're imposing new measures because there's now an India strain or India variant going around. Yeah, so what? Trust in the vaccines, trust in the immune systems. If we continue to throw a tantrum every time there's a new variant, which will happen 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times per year, it's complete nonsense. Right? So Mr. Johnson, just stop it. But as I said earlier, that's why he won the prize. He went from one extreme to the other extreme. We would be so much better off if our politicians just did nothing. Right? As I said last time, right? If we had monkey governments, we would be better off. Right? Chimpanzees in government would be better than our politicians. They would do much less damage. But so our politicians, they probably choose to continue doing a lot of damage to us over the next few months, even though in those back to normal countries here, they There's no reason for them to do anything now. They could just say, we're done. As I said, if I'm right, maybe Sweden is doing a little bit of that by not reporting the numbers anymore, but maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, maybe I'm too optimistic there. Okay, muddled through countries. Yeah, so the Europeans, I have to say, they've done a good job in the last month rolling out vaccines generally. So after a slow start, they're catching up. They're now on a really strong trajectory. Now, I said before, with vaccines, of course, I don't have visibility into each country and their supplies. Often you have an effect where they get a new round of supply from some supplier, and they roll it out, and the numbers of vaccinations go up steeply, and then all of a sudden it stops again because they run out of the supply, and then they have to wait a while until they get the next supply. So the supply is discontinuous, and therefore the rollouts become discontinuous, right? So they can go from very steep to very flat and then steep again. So in some countries, it really looks like a step function rather than a smooth, sort of more or less linear curve, or ideally exponential curve at the early stage. So the reality is that you may have a good month or even a good week, and for this forecast, the effective aggregate run rate, which is basically the last 7 days, and how much herd immunity percentage were added in on a monthly basis, so it's adjusted to a month, which I then use to calculate how many months will it take until they reach 80%, right? That's the bar chart on the right, right? So these EARR, the effective aggregate run rate, which includes both the IR and the VR, so the natural infection activity as well as vaccination activity, as I said, compounded with trying to avoid the double counting. And the last 7 days of that in some countries are very, very strong because they just happen at the moment to have a major boost. And in some other countries, it may be very slow just because maybe they ran out of supply or some other reason. So always you have to take these projections based on 7-day run rates very much with a big grain of salt, because every week these numbers change, right? They give you very rough, high-level indication maybe, but no more than that, right? So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but of course the pattern is clear. The back to normal countries are done. The muddled through, they're sort of more or less getting there, some of them quicker than others. And the new normal countries are still very far away from getting done. Now, South Korea, within the sample, is an exception. South Korea recently has really ramped up the vaccination. So as if South Korea has now decided, okay, we do want to go back to normal. So, but again, whether that trend continues, I don't know, right? So we have to be cautious. But at the current trend, South Korea is only 7.3 months away from reaching herd immunity, and almost entirely on the back of vaccination, if you continue at the breakneck speed at which they're currently vaccinated. We will see. Yeah. Japan is talking about vaccinations now. We are starting, the vaccinations are on their way, they will come. Now, given that they're one of the wealthiest countries in the world, you really wonder why they're starting like now. I mean, 6 months after the Brits. But here you go, because again, they had not too many fatalities in Japan. The mentality is, oh, we had it under control, and nobody complains, because very collectivist kind of society, and government says so it must be right. Yeah, and so no vaccinations. Pretty amazing. Right? Despite the fact that for 6 months now, we have known full well that these vaccines really work, right? But no rush. Yeah. No, it's not quite true. Japan has started now. So they are early days, but they have now started with ramping up the vaccination. So probably over the next month or two, we'll see that timeline shorten. And for the world as a whole, which is of course not really meaningful, because this is really, unfortunately, all happening on a country by country level. It shouldn't have, but that's how we designed it, country by country, our governments, because they're national governments, so that's how they think, right? Their thinking stops at their border, right? In fact, they don't think at all. if they were to think, they would stop their thinking at their own border. Right? So a worldview is not very meaningful now because the vaccination rollouts are so different. But for what it's worth, if we average it all out, the world is only 3 months away from 80% herd immunity. So that's all actually maybe the best, most optimistic view I've had on this ever since I started this series of videos. Or even started to write letters to Frau Merkel last April. So that's been, what, 14 months now that I've been systematically thinking about this. And I think this, in terms of what's actually happening on the ground, I'm now more optimistic than ever because even the latecomers are now starting to roll out the vaccines, recognizing that the vaccines work, right? I've always said we don't really need the vaccines to stop this madness. We could have just stopped this madness at any time if we had wanted to. But humans being humans, I think our governments need something to hold on to say, now we can go back to normal. Right? And that something are the vaccines. And since they're easy to produce and cheap to produce, and they're flooding the markets now, we will get done with fatalities very quickly. So if you like, in the real world, good news. Now, apart from the real world, to speak with Lacan, there's an imaginary world which takes place in the heads of politicians. And that world is boring. For example, governments still ordering billions of doses of vaccination. The EU announced 1 billion for next year. And you go like, we won't need any vaccination next year. We will be done this year. No, they ordered 1.5 or so billion doses of vaccines for next year. Now, you may say, they want to be on the safe side just in case if some really funny new variant comes up. Or, yeah, okay. You can spin it positively if you want. But what it tells me is that they have no view that we are almost done. They don't believe it, or they don't understand what we are discussing here, right? They have a mindset they will continue, I don't know, forever, right? And that's what worries me, that while on the real action on the ground, we are almost done, in our heads, we are far from done. Very far from done. And some politicians, you almost get the feeling they're moving backwards. Like the lesser the actual problem on the ground, the greater their, I don't know, the anxiety to do something and to install something and implement something and institutionalize something that can terrorize their populations. Right? So it's almost an inverse movement. And you saw that on our scenarios already. That's the trend, right? The lighter the COVID problem, the heavier the government problem. I don't get it, but that's really happening. And there's yet a lot in the imaginary and the symbolic space, meaning the space of the laws and the regulations. There's yet a lot that can go wrong, and even wronger, even worse than what we've seen so far. The sky is the limit in terms of what governments can impose on us, right? In the real, there's lots of reason to be optimistic. And that was so from the very beginning of this virus. Remember when we started scenarios in April, there was still some, maybe the virus turns out to be more dangerous than we think. But we had that as a scenario on our axis for our scenarios. But already in May, I remember we were like, the virus is clearly trending towards insignificant or moderate in its severity, right? Or COVID, we call it. COVID is become clearly trending towards moderate, right? So even last May, that was already emerging as quite clear, right? And this is now 12 months since last May, or 13 almost. And government policy just has gone from worse to worse to worse, right? And so if you project that out, if you just project that could continue, oh my gosh, I mean, I can't even imagine what crazy ideas governments will come up with to harass people. Right? Obviously, this vaccination passport is one of the worst things on the horizon right now, but who knows, right? What else people come up with? Right? I lack the imagination to fill that in. But that's what I mean by the imaginary and the symbolic space, which is the language Lacan, the psychoanalyst, famous psychoanalyst, uses. Right? So there's the real world. That's one thing. But how we imagine our world, and then how we install our own symbolic, reality onto that real world in the form of laws and regulations and institutions and so on, is quite another thing. And it can be quite decoupled from the real world. Right? And that's my fear, that we, over the next few months, we will see more and more decoupling, as we already saw in the scenarios, but even more so, between the real activity, which is getting ever more benign, and the imaginary perspective on, virus, and we have to prepare, and we have to do something. We have to set up a center in Berlin, like Frau Merkel and Tedros, for global monitoring, and all these things that will be imposed on us on the basis, it could happen again. It could happen again. Yeah. That's imaginary. People starting to imagine, they imagine the Hollywood style, the worst possible disasters. Right? And then in the symbolic space, which is the space of laws and regulations, they will then actually do things and implement and institutionalize things, which then, once they're there, don't go away again, right? And then all of a sudden you're stuck with them. We've long forgotten about the virus, this particular virus. Nobody will remember in a few years, but all these laws and regulations that we're now creating, they will still be there. That's the worry. Okay. Yeah, so my usual summary: severity of COVID tending towards insignificance. So this is the one axis of the scenarios, right? We're currently at 62% penetration, going towards near 100. I've created another category. I call it infection ratio. It's similar to the first category, but different in one respect, which is the percentage of humanity that gets exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, meaning once at least, can only be 100%, cannot be higher than 100%. But the ratio, the number of infections over the number of population can be more than 100%. Why? Because we can be infected again and again and again. Actually, I think I made a little mistake here. I said, assume every one of us, on average, during their life, will be infected 10 times by this virus, right? Then the infection ratio will not be 100%, it will be 1,000%. So this ratio of infections over people can be above 100% because each person can be infected more than once. Whereas the first ratio up there, the way I defined it, it can only go to 100% because it basically means the percentage of people who have been exposed to the virus once, that can only go to 100%. But if you take into account that, of course, you can be reinfected, and the reinfection can be with a different variant and possibly even a different strain, where our immune system may in fact be challenged, right? Then, of course, it can be well above 100%. And as I say, assume 10 times in your life, then the number is 1,000. So I misstated here. I shouldn't have said 10,000, but I should have said 1,000. Right? I'll correct that. But just to raise that point that the virus isn't going to go away. It's going to continue evolving and mutating. There will be new variants, just like with influenza, and just like with other common cold viruses, and we will be reinfected again and again and again. And the only way to prevent these reinfections would be to diligently get a booster vaccination every, 9 months or so. But nobody's going to do that, right? Unless the governments force us to do that. And nobody will want to do that because it's completely pointless. We don't do that with other common colds, and we don't do that with influenza either, unless maybe we are, my mother who is 84 and occasionally says, okay, maybe it's a good idea I do that. Right? But then we do it on a purely voluntary basis, and it's administered purely on the level of the healthcare system, and government policy plays no role in that. Percentage of infected people who fall ill, it's about 1% who have severe symptoms and need hospitalization. And with vaccines now, that's going to go towards near 0% in the future. And the IFR, yeah, naturally, currently I have it at 0.19%, hasn't changed for a while. It's going to drop with vaccinations now, it's going to drop towards near 0. I'm watching Brazil very closely. In Brazil, the fatality figures are still quite high and they somehow don't come down as expected. I mean, Brazil is now at roughly 80% penetration in my model. So you would really expect to start to see the fatality numbers coming down. They're not really at the moment, so that's a bit surprising. So I will monitor Brazil very closely. Why? Because if in Brazil the fatalities remain fairly high, then I have to adjust my model. And it so happens that in Brazil, the multiplier for the fatalities is only 1.1. So registered fatalities are whatever they report, right, on Worldometer. And in my model, the actual fatalities for Brazil are 1.1 times that much. So it's not a big multiplier, it's a small multiplier. So if the fatalities still stay high, I can reduce that multiplier to 1. That, to stay within the model. But I cannot reduce it below 1 because my convention is, even though there may be some overcounting, in fact, I think I mentioned a long time ago, there was this professor in Hamburg who did abductions on, 40 fatalities, COVID-linked fatalities, and he found 20% of them had actually died of something else. So he claimed that there was systematic over-reporting of fatalities, but I think that's doubtful because even in those cases, even if the immediate cause of death, let's say, was a heart attack, if the people had heavy pneumonia from having been infected with SARS-CoV-2, that pneumonia may still have had something to do with a heart effect, right? You can't disentangle these things easily. So I've early on decided I will not, in my model, I will not admit that there could be over-reporting of fatalities, although I know conceptually there could be, and there probably is occasionally, right? I know that, yeah, there will be some over-reporting in there, but it's not very significant probably, and also it's very difficult to track or impossible to know, because most countries don't do abductions on all these fatalities, and they shouldn't really. Why should they, right? And there haven't been enough studies to really give me enough to hold on to and say, okay, systematically we're overcounting by 10%. Right, so adjust for that? No. So I've just said no. There's no no overcounting, but there is undercounting. That's why I have this multiplier, right? So Brazil can go down to 1, but not lower. So if I adjust Brazil down to 1 and the fatalities still continue to come in high, there will be a point where it forces me to say, oh, my IFR must be too low. So I can use Brazil as that, I talked about this before, how I'm trying to get to that IFR that is sort of the correct natural IFR by recalibrating and looking at my countries. Brazil is relevant, A, because its multiplier is low, so there's not much adjustment space there. There's much wiggle space, like in India, where I just wiggle it down. So that's good. So that forces me to find another way to make it fit. And secondly, because in Brazil, the vaccinations are not very high yet, and they've only recently started. So Brazil, over the next month or two, could be the country that forces me to adjust the IFR a little bit higher. That's probably my last chance to make any calibration to the IFR. And if Brazil doesn't do that job, then probably the IFR will stay at 0.19%, and that's it in my model, because more and more vaccinations take over, and I cannot longer see any kind of natural progression, because vaccination just overlays it completely, right? And at that point, I cannot adjust and fine-tune my assumptions anymore. Right? So if at all, it will be possibly on the back of Brazil over the next month or two that I may still make some adjustment to the IFR. And then it's going to be locked in for good. And hoping that I got the number roughly right. But there will not be any new grounds, any new data that will allow me to make any further adjustments to it. Okay. COVID-19 trending towards insignificance, so that's the other axis of the scenario frame. As I always say, number of people killed by the virus, 0. I just love to repeat that because 99% of people on this planet apparently think that this virus is dangerous and kills people, but it doesn't. It triggers an immune reaction. That's what it does, right? But it triggers that down here. It triggers that immune reaction in your lung where it's dangerous only in 1% of the people because their immune system is too slow to prevent the virus from getting down, remember? But the virus itself is not poisonous or anything. It doesn't kill. It's the immune reaction that kills. So a number of people killed by the over or underreacting immune system at the moment, 7.4. With my current IFR 0.19, the calculated expected fatalities are 12.2 million. So we are 4.8 million below that sort of calculated number, endpoint, if you like, where it would stop. Meaning we are at 62% of that theoretical maximum, right? So we are approaching it slowly. But as I said earlier, now with the vaccines and so on, we will never reach it probably. And that would be good. Then if we stay below the 12.2, then we can credit the vaccines. Yeah? They have saved lives. Now, the second component, though, there's a certain number of people who died surplus or excess mortality due to government policies and errors. And those at the moment are 1.6 million in my model. And what you want to compare is the delta on the left here, the 4.8 that we are sort of saving, and the 1.6 that we are murdering, if you like, if I may put it bluntly. Right? The 1.6 million are sort of victims of government policy, but the 4.8 that we are falling short of the expected number would be people saved, predominantly saved by the vaccines. But to some degree, maybe also saved by government policy, which can work hand in hand with vaccines, as I explained earlier in the case of Sweden. So we are comparing those two numbers. And in the end of the day, when the dust settles, if this delta, which is currently 4.8, remains higher than that number on the top right, that additional deaths from government errors, then we have had a net positive impact from government policy, including vaccines. If, however, the delta shrinks ever further to the point where the number on the top right is bigger than the delta, then our government policies will have net killed people, meaning more people died than if we had done nothing. It'll be interesting to see, right? My guess and my hope is, of course, that we will have saved some people net in the end. But it will not be many. In my view, I anticipate that there will be no balance or relationship between the massive disruptions we've imposed on 8 billion people compared to in the end, probably relatively meager number of people saved. But that's then you get into a level of where you talk about subjective evaluations. Right? There may be people who say, "Oh, every single life matters, and one single person saved already was worth all this effort." Right? Maybe someone will go to that length. In which case, of course, you could respond, "Well, so many people die. I mean, everybody has to die, right?" And so as I said at the very beginning, we don't actually save people. Only God can save people, and He only saves souls. Right? We can only prolong their life. Right? They die eventually, right? 100%. So, so actually, what we are not really saving people. We are adding. If all goes well, we've net added some lifespan to their lives. And that needs to be compared with the massive amounts of many years that our policies have, if not completely destroyed, but certainly massively impact negative. That is the comparison. Right? And I don't think there will be any way to find that, oh, the government policies were net effective and positive. I think there's just simply no way we could come to that conclusion under no circumstances. Yeah. But we may find, yes, they have saved some lives, if not many. That we may, I'm quite confident, and that's predominantly thanks to the vaccines. Okay. We shall see. Global response trending towards disasters, percentage of humanity taken hostage in a state of exception, 99%, I said. And I only said 99% because I'm pretending there may be a few people somewhere in the jungle who are not affected at all. In fact, there may be a lot of people not directly affected, because if they live in a way where they're not part of the globalized economy, where they're not really affected. I mean, there may well be some people in the world who are not really affected by this, but not very many, right? And you may say, but now that back to normal countries, for example, that they're starting to really open up again. I mean, you have UFC, 15,000 people in a sports arena with no impositions on them, or no discriminations against anybody else. Aren't we now seeing this number drop? Yeah, I mean, the US, for example, yes, they're really on their way towards back to normal, but for example, they have not yet dropped their travel restrictions to foreign countries. They have not, and they've not even talked about it, right? As far as I can see. So, no, or Sweden, right? They're still probably at the moment demanding anybody who wants to enter Sweden to have a negative test. So, no, we're not actually really back to normal yet. What I was saying earlier, we could be any day if you wanted to, right? But nobody is yet really going back to normal. And the problem also is, since some of these things are mutual, like border crossings, it doesn't help you if you decide, oh, my people can travel, if the country next door, or it doesn't have to be next door, any country around the world, if they say, yeah, but you can't come to us. Yeah. So if a single country in the world says we keep our borders closed, then we are not back to normal, really, right? Because that country is then off limits to anybody else, right? So to really be back to normal means every single country has to be back to normal. And I think we are miles away from that. Now you may say, yeah, but not everybody will want to travel to that country anyways. It's true, but I can't figure out those numbers, right? I can just say, well, at least in theory, you might want to travel to that country and you can't, right? Or you could, but you would have to do 2 weeks of quarantine, which is so prohibitive, so you won't, right? Unless you must for, I don't know, business reasons or something. Right? You wouldn't, or your family, otherwise you wouldn't. So no, we're still at a place, unfortunately, where 99% of us are significantly impacted. And as I said earlier, that doesn't seem to go away quickly. And yeah, a number of many is severely disrupted. We are now well into year 2. And that number will just continue going up, and economic and social cost. I mean, IMF estimated $22 trillion. I don't know whether that number still holds. I mean, the economies are rebounding quite well. So the economic damage in the end may turn out to have been less than the IMF had predicted here, but we'll see. And yeah, the expected duration of the state of exception, yeah, that's related to the 99% up there, possibly in some countries indefinitely. And that's not even limited to only totalitarian states or authoritarian states, which are anyways at any moment in a state of exception. That even may be the case for democracies. They're not fully lifting the state of exception, meaning they're not fully returning people's rights to their people. To be seen, right? Vaccination progression, so 1% of the world population statistically gets seriously ill, so they're the ones who really benefit from the vaccine. If they haven't already been seriously, so that's 78 million, but of course that includes those more than half who already were hit, right? So actually at this stage, there are only like 30 million or so left who still really benefit from the vaccine. So the number of people who really benefit from the vaccine is surprisingly small. This is the global figure, right? Yeah, even including China. This is even including China. Right? This is on the base of 7.8 billion people. Actually, by now we are 7.9 billion, I noticed. But yeah, so I should say 79 here. Since more than half of these already had the illness and either died or recovered, the number is by now is only like 30 million. So at this point, only 30 million people in this entire world actually benefit from the vaccine. All others don't actually benefit from it. Doesn't mean they don't have to take it. And the reason is, of course, we can't pinpoint each individual who would get sick. We can only statistically, based on heuristics, say, well, we know what types they are and what group they're in. We call them risk groups, and we can target those risk groups, but we cannot target the individual person because we cannot anticipate you will be sick and you will not be sick. that we are not able to do. So that's why we are targeting a much bigger group of people than just that 1%. And as I said before, in my calculation, what we're targeting globally is about 13%. Those are all the people over 65, plus all the people who are obese, plus all the people who have diabetes in the world. Now, depending on which country you're in, that number can be bigger. In a place like Germany or US, where you have a lot of aging, a lot of obesity, a lot of diabetics, that number is significantly higher, maybe 30% of the population, even a bit more than 30% of the population, maybe 40% in the extreme. Right? Of course, there are also countries maybe in Africa where very useful population, or in just simply countries where there's very little obesity, very little diabetics, where the number is much lower. Right? There will be some special cases. I spoke about that a long time ago. If a country has a civil war or famine or malnourishment, immune systems may be significantly compromised, even in age groups that normally wouldn't fit into any of our risk categories. Right? So Yemen, or some province in Ethiopia where they have civil war. So I mean, there are special cases where countries will have a much higher risk group than their demographics suggest because of those special cases. Right? But I cannot survey them all, and I cannot be granular enough to figure all of that out. Right? So these are rough and ready figures, but globally that's about the number we should target with vaccination. So 1 billion people should be vaccinated. And then we would have the high likelihood to have covered all of those 30 million who actually benefit from it. Yeah. In reality, we've now already done 1.5 billion shots. Now, since most vaccines are double shot, you might say, yeah, but we need 2 billion to reach that 1 billion, to have them fully vaccinated. Yeah, true. So, but we are well on our way towards that, having hit that 1 billion. Unfortunately, as I said before, many of those vaccines go to people who don't need them. So they're not going towards this target group. So you would have to modify the actuals down by all those that are being wasted. And then we are still at this point well below actually hitting all those 1 billion that we actually want to hit. Right? But some of the countries are listed, especially the back to normal countries, but also some of the European countries, they're getting there. No? They're getting to a point now where they have actually vaccinated everyone who should be vaccinated and who wants it. Some people will just say, I don't want it, right? And at least in those countries, maybe you really can't force them. No matter what you try, you can ultimately force them. So there will always be some people who should have been vaccinated but were not, right? But those are relatively small percentages, it seems, right? So most people who are really in risk groups, they do come forth and they do get vaccinated. And so in some countries, we are getting to the point that we have covered all those we ought to cover. Yeah. And some other countries are still very far away from that. Right? On average, we are probably more than halfway there. That's my guess. Yeah, but we're making good progress. So we have a few more months and we will have covered everyone we wanted to cover except those who just simply say, I don't want to, or they are in really remote, live in very remote places and we are just not finding them. Of course, there will be those people, but by and large, we will have covered everyone we want to cover within a matter of a few months. Now, on the far right, as you know, my criticism, or this is more about the imaginary and the symbolic than the real, but it turns into a new real, which is governments may just force us all to get way more vaccinations than we ever needed. So we will end up 30 million people actually benefiting from the vaccine, but 7 billion or more people being vaccinated on multiple vaccinations on a regular basis. So billions and billions and billions of vaccinations in order to help 30 million people actually benefit from it, which is completely disproportionate. I'm in a loss of words for that. Okay, we need a paradigm shift. So I'm almost done. Bear with me. I've said this before, so it's actually a repetition. I've said it a little bit differently. Last time I did it with a little graphic of a turtle, a comic strip, if you remember. This was in October, a while ago, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months ago. I had this turtle lying on its back, legs in the air, and a turtle, when they are on their back, it's almost impossible for them to flip back onto their legs, right? So totally helpless, lying there, Then you turn the picture around on its head, and you have the turtle up in the sky, flying. Oh, I can fly, super! Remember that? That's paradigm shift, right? You just turn it around, it looks very different, right? Okay, so the classical example in the philosophy of science for paradigm shift in science is what's called the Copernican revolution, where Nicolaus Copernicus was one of the people. He was maybe not the only one, but one of the key people, for once and for all clarifying that not the sun travels around the earth, but the earth travels around the sun, right? Until Copernicus, which is late 15th, early 16th century, so Renaissance, late Renaissance, until his day, the vast majority of people, with a few exceptions, believed in the so-called Ptolemaic model, which was defined by a Greek astronomer and philosopher in the, I think, 2nd or 3rd century AD, by the name of Ptolemaios. So it's named after him, and he defined, a view of the solar system, which had the Earth stationary at the center, and then the moon, the sun, and then all the planets circling around the Earth. And this model was, of course, held in high regard by the Catholic Church, or the Christians in general, because of the story of the Genesis in the Old Testament and the idea that man is sort of at the center of the universe that God created, right? So the idea that the Earth is in the center and stationary fitted precisely to the Christian religion, which was shortly after Ptolemaios starting to really spread out across the Roman Empire and beyond, right? So that's why this Ptolemaic model survived for over 1,000 years, because it suited the church very, very well. So they had no interest in getting it refuted. But finally, in the Renaissance, the Renaissance was a period in which everything was possible, anything and everything was possible. Right? New ideas were possible after centuries of the church sort of dominating everything. So Copernicus showed without any beyond any doubt that the Earth was traveling around the sun, not the other way. So that's called paradigm shift. So all of a sudden, the whole world said, "Oh, we have to completely, by 180 degrees, shift our perception of what's actually the case." So that's called a paradigm shift. Immanuel Kant, one of the most important philosophers of modern times in the West, created a new idealist philosophy whereby he said, instead of what the rationalists and the empiricists, the rationalists were Descartes and his followers, especially in France, but also elsewhere on the continent of Europe, and the empiricists were primarily in England and Scotland. Both the rationalists and the empiricists believed that the object, any object, it is what it is, and our knowledge of that object must conform to the physical reality of that object. Okay, so the object is a given, and our knowledge of it is something that needs to embrace it as it is, the object as object. Right? Now, Kant demonstrated that it's the opposite. The reverse is the case, because the way our brain functions and our sensual organs, our eyes, for example, function prescribes, predetermines to some degree what we can see and know. We can only know things the way our brain structure and our brain processes allow us to know it. Okay, so instead of the object being given and shaping our perception, Kant said it's the opposite. Our perceptions and our way of thinking and acquiring knowledge about things, empirical knowledge through our sense organs, or conceptual knowledge through our thinking process, our rationality, whatever it is our thought process and our way of acquiring knowledge that shapes the object. In other words, to us, this object is a book. But it's only a book because we make it so through our perception. In our perception, this is a book. If we were ants, then, and we encountered this object, for us, this would just be an opaque, solid object that we cannot penetrate. So we have to climb over it. To an ant, this is not a book, okay? Because in the mind world of the ant, there is no such thing as books. There are only objects that can be eaten, or objects that are in the way and you can climb over them. And sometimes maybe there are objects like, I don't know, like a slippery glass, which you cannot even climb up. Oh, ants, they can climb up almost anything. But you see what I say. In their perceptive world, there is no such thing as a book, right? It's only in a book for us humans, because that's how our perception of this object works, right? And we are imposing our perception onto that book. Okay. So I think you got the point, right? So Kant called or drew a parallel between his new philosophy and his new way of looking at how we acquire knowledge. And he compared that with the Copernican revolution that had happened, 300 or so years before his time, right? And that his way of looking at how we acquire knowledge is just as much a paradigm shift. He didn't call it paradigm shift, he called it the Copernican revolution, as was the original Copernican insight, right? Another example, Karl Marx. Karl Marx said, I'm going to turn Hegel being the leading idealist philosopher of his day, of the early 19th century. Marx came a little bit after him. He was a student of his. And Marx said, Hegel got it all wrong. Hegel said, the basis of society are ideas and concepts and institutionalized processes, such as laws, right? Or scientific theories, or those types of things. And he said, those are the foundation of a society, on top of which we then build our sort of physical reality, our empirical daily lives, right? Marx said, no, it's the opposite. It's our empirical, our material lives, the way, for example, we produce, consume, and exchange goods. What do we eat? How do we produce what we eat? How do we survive, right? At a very basic physical level. That is the foundation of any society. And then the laws and all the theories and all the concepts, they all come on top. He called it a superstructure. So the empirical reality of everyday life is the infrastructure, he said, and those conceptual ideas and laws. Earlier I called with Lacan, I called them the symbolic and the imaginary. They are on top. So the opposite view of Hegel. So Marx said, I'm going to turn Hegel upside down. Right? So that's another example in philosophy of a paradigm shift. There's a somewhat related concept, which is perspectivism, for which the philosopher Nietzsche is best known. So Nietzsche says, in order to really gain a thorough understanding of an object or a thought or a concept, we have to look at it from various aspects and various perspectives. It's not sufficient to look at it just from one direction. Right? So he systematically practiced the philosophy of perspectivism, where whatever problem he was dealing with, he would look at it from different angles. And sometimes these different angles were quite contradictory at first sight. So some of his critics said, oh, what he's writing is contradictory. It's illogical because he says A and then he says B, and those two, A and B, are not compatible. Right? But when you look closely and follow his thought closely, you realize A and B are not the same, but they are not incompatible. There is the level of synthesis at which they make sense together, and they give you a higher level of understanding if they come together. Right? So, I mean, a classical example is from Indian mythology, I think, or from Indian folklore, maybe. There's a story of the 4 blind men. They come into the village and they're shown an elephant. They're blind, so they can't actually see the elephant. And the mahout of the elephant, okay, you touch the elephant, he doesn't say elephant, you touch here, you touch here, you touch here, and you touch here. So that each of them get to touch a different part of the elephant. So one blind man gets to touch the trunk of the elephant, and he says, oh, this is a water hose. And the second one gets to touch the leg. And he said, oh, I have a tree trunk here, right? And the third one gets to touch the ear, the big flabby ear of the elephant, right? He said, oh, it's a sail, like for a boat, right? And the last one, he gets to touch the tail of the elephant. And he said, oh, it's a big brush, right? If they were to put these things together, they might realize this is actually an elephant, you see? So each of them just looks at the elephant or touches the elephant from a different angle. But if they don't bring their knowledge together and pool it in such a way that they can synthesize this into a sort of a more holistic understanding, they will never realize it's a story, right? It's a story, but they will never realize they were touching an elephant if they had never seen an elephant before. They never touched an elephant. Okay, so that's the story that goes along with this perspectivism. You have to look at certain problems from different directions and bring those different perspectives together, and only then can you really make sense of it. Right? That's not exactly the same as a paradigm shift where you kind of flip from one to the other, one side to the other, which is like two perspectives that are kind of opposite. It's more like multi-perspective, right? So it's just, it's a slightly different concept. But it's also related to my point, which is my point about COVID is, of course, we need perspectivism. We need to look at this from multiple angles, not just from one angle. And we need a paradigm shift insofar as people have now fairly settled on the idea that this is all about a virus. And I keep saying, no, this is not predominantly about a virus. Yes, a virus plays a role in this, but not the biggest role. At the center of this, in my view, is the human immune system and the social choice we are making about aging, about lifestyles that are not compatible always with healthy immune systems. Because, for example, we become overweight and obese, and we acquire heart and lung diseases, civilizational diseases, they are called, right? They are effects of our lifestyle choices. And aging is an effect of our choices around medical care, hygiene, technology, etc. Right? And I have no problem with any of these choices, to be very clear, right? They're all wonderful choices that people can make. But we would need to accompany these choices with a debate about what are the implications and possible unintended side effects of these choices, right? And one unintended side effect of aging is immune systems degenerate over time as you get older. That's just the case. And of course, we may then say, yeah, other things we can do to keep immune systems up and running as well as we can. And yeah, there are. There are prophylactics, there's vitamin D, there's just general healthy lifestyle, exercise. I mean, there are lots of things you can do to keep your immune system as healthy as possible. Yeah, but we're not having that debate. The entire debate right now is about we have to kill the virus, kill the virus. We are at war with the virus. We have to defeat the virus. That's a single perspective instead of having a multiple perspectivism, looking at the problem from multiple sides. And it's a perspective on an element that is not the most important one. We would be better off if we just focused on our immune systems. But I'm not necessarily saying we just focus on another thing. I'm saying let's be perspectivists and focus. We can do multiple things at once and bring them together. I mean, it's completely possible, right? But certainly what's wrong is that we're just focused on the virus. The virus is just a natural given. There will be other viruses coming our way, inevitably, right? So that's just a natural thing, a given. Now, we may be mindful of it. We may have an early warning system. Oh, new virus comes. Okay, let's do the right things. I mean, we can have all of those things. I have no objection to that at all. Yes, we may want to find out where this virus came from so that we have an idea how do these viruses get over to us? And is there something we should change so that it's not so easy for them to come to us? I mean, all of those things are wonderful, right? I'm not objecting to any of those ideas, right? But our current single-minded focus on defeating, which is a totally implausible concept, to defeat a virus. There's no such thing. to be at war with a virus that doesn't exist. You can only be at war with humans. Conceptually, the word war only goes along with humans. You cannot be at war with a virus. It's just impossible, right? So it's just bullshit. But this bullshit shapes how people perceive the situation. And then they make decisions and act in ways that is completely either irrelevant or even counterproductive. Okay. Hysteria, hysteresis, remember that was my headline. Hysteria is an exaggerated or uncontrollable emotion or excitement, as you know. So we are, right now, we are in a phase of hysteria, massively so. If you did a survey around the world, whether people are afraid of the virus, I bet you 50, 60, 70% of the population in different countries would say, I'm afraid of this virus. If you asked people around the world, do you think this virus is dangerous? I bet you 99% of the world population would say, this virus is dangerous. Except it isn't. If you believe the virus is dangerous, then you may as well believe that the earth is flat. It's the same akin in terms of thinking. It's just hanging on to some perception for which there's no basis. This virus is entirely harmless. It is our immune systems that are problematic in some cases. Okay, so we're in a phase of hysteria, and I suspect with the vaccines rolling out and working, the hysteria will slowly ebb away, as hysterias usually do. You know, they sort of run their course because it's high energy. It takes a lot of energy to be hysterical. Not all people can be hysterical at all times. It's not possible. So I expect this hysteria that we are experiencing at the moment, I expect over the next few months, it will slowly trend away. However, what it leaves behind is what's called a hysteresis. Hysteresis is a phenomenon whereby the effects of an event linger on long after the event itself is over. That's called hysteresis. And I've talked about it before, so I'm repeating myself now, but my fear is that the hysteria will go away, but the hysteresis is here to stay, meaning the effects of our decision making today, whether it's vaccination passports, border closures, new levels of scrutiny, of sharing of personal data that you wouldn't want to share, but you are forced to share, new restrictions about where you can go when you want to go, what you can do when you want to do it, all of these things, that they will stay and linger on for months and months and years and maybe decades to come. Whereas the original event, which is the event of this new virus, will long have been forgotten. So we are maybe at the cusp right now from shifting from the period of hysteria into the period of hysteresis. But the hysteresis may take much, much longer than the hysteria. Hysteresis may die down only very, very slowly, if ever. Yeah. That's why I was saying earlier, we are by no means near the end of this. We are not even at the beginning of the end. There is, in fact, no end in sight as long as in our minds we do not do the paradigm shift that I described. So with that, paradigm shift would mean I would be able to take my Pokemon here and turn him back. Doraemon, I'm sorry. My Doraemon and turn him back onto his feet. Just like Marx turned Hegel back on his feet. So he said, I'm waiting for the day that I can take my Doraemon and turn him back onto his feet. That day may still be quite far away, I fear, and I guess I will see you in the meantime. Take care.